Hey there, welcome to this Bible study of Ephesians chapter 5, verses 18 through 33. This is essentially what I'm going to do is I'm just going to walk with you through a text that we'll be looking at here at Sunny Slope in the next day or two in our worship service. And I'm just going to take you through the first, really about the first stage of getting a text ready for preaching, and in the process of doing that, we'll kind of highlight some things, we'll kind of ask some questions, and my hope is that as we do this, you get to learn a little bit more about how to study the Bible, but also you'll get to see a little bit about it'll kind of get you ready to hear a message on this text. So here we go. I'm going to pull up my screen and put it in front of you, and then I'll get my little handy tool. And let's begin. So again, you can see we're starting. Here's our text, Ephesians 5, 18 through 33. A little later on, you're going to see that this is this is a controversial passage because it deals with submission. Now, I'm drawing your attention to that because you're going to see that this is maybe there's a bigger context here that informs what this is really all about. So I'm drawing your attention. I'm highlighting the fact that this is a passage that is somewhat controversial in our day and age, but I want you to see, and I want to show you as we get into it, that there's really more going on here than you might originally realize. So let's start. We get off to a beginning here with what I've always found to be kind of an unusual saying. Paul begins with a command here: do not get drunk with wine, but be filled with the Holy Spirit. So anytime you see the words do not, but, obviously that's indicating two actions that are contrasting. Don't do this, but do this instead. And in between, we find the reason. Why do we not do that? Debauchery. Now, debauchery is a word we don't know really a whole lot what that actually means. We don't use it a lot today. It's kind of an antiquated word. So we're going to just make a note of that and come back to that a little bit later. But here's the point. What Paul is doing is he's commanding not drunkenness, but being filled with the Spirit. Now, there's a couple things I think worth noting there. The one is the relationship between being filled with the Spirit and being drunk on wine. We're going to ask the question, how are these two things here related? What ties together overuse of alcohol with being filled with the Spirit? We're going to want to look at that. Now, there's another thing that you kind of learn this by learning to pay attention to grammar. And just so you can see this a little bit more clearly, I'm going to erase something that oops, there we go. Let's erase this here. Just because I want to highlight something, and that is this. Be filled with the Spirit. Specifically, the word be filled it's an imperative, and an imperative is a verb tense that it's a command. It's telling us to do something. And so I'll just make a note of that here. That's the imperative. It's a command, but then right next to it is a series of participles. Now, participles, you can always tell because they end in ing, right? You can see these here. Addressing, singing, making melody, giving thanks, and you can maybe see where we're going with this, submitting. Now, whenever you're looking at the grammar of a text like this, you always have to understand that participles, they cannot stand by themselves. In other words, you'd never, if I were to say to you, addressing one another in Psalms, well, you'd say that's not really a complete sentence. It's missing a verb, right? So participles always have to be tied to a verb. And the participles really tell you something about how that verb works, right? In other words, a participle, the technical word is that a participle modifies a verb. It fills in some information, or it expands on or nuances how the verb is done. So if I say something like running to the store, that's not a complete sentence. That's a participle. But if I say I helped my wife out by running to the store, you see the relationship. The main thing is that I helped my wife. How did I help her? Well, I did it by running to the store, and you can kind of do anything like that. Now, the reason that's important is because you can't isolate all of these things, particularly submitting, which we're going to get to in a minute, unless you understand the main verb, the main idea here, which is be filled with the Spirit. Paul's big concern here, and this is the thing that we're going to draw lots of attention to. We want to really emphasize that. Paul is really saying, I want you to be filled with the Spirit. And he almost imagines the Ephesians asking the question, well, okay, Paul, that sounds good, but what does that mean? Well, Paul's going to go on. He's going to tell us, what does it look like to be filled with the Spirit? Well, addressing one another in psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs. Here's one thing. Singing. 2, making melody to the Lord with your heart. 3, giving thanks always. 4, for everything. That's kind of, this little sentence modifies that one. And then finally 5, submitting to one another. All of these things here are marks of the Holy Spirit. This is what a Spirit-filled life is meant to look like. It's definitely not what good letters look like, but you get the idea here. This is a Spirit-filled life. This is what Paul is after. Now, a couple of key things here. Paul is telling us that all Christians, and here's where we're going to draw some attention. We're going to highlight a word here. We're going to just highlight this word, submitting to one another. All Christians, submission is not just something that women do to men. It's not something that wives just do to their husbands, but it's a mark of the Spirit. A Spirit-filled life is a life of submission in which all believers are submitting to one another. We are all putting the needs of other people before ourselves, and we're doing it out of reverence for Christ. Now, there are some specific cases in which submission is called for, because Paul goes on and he says, wives, submit to your own husbands as to the Lord. And so here's another command, but this command cannot be isolated from the overarching command. So yes, it's true that wives submit, but that's true of all believers. So it's also true, you could say, of, husbands are to serve and to submit their wives as well, but there's a unique form of submission that wives are called to in a marriage relationship. Now, it's important, I think, to recognize that this is a marriage ordinance. It's not a woman to man sort of pattern in which all women have to submit to all men in a unique way. It's something that applies in a marriage relationship. Now, we're going to ask some questions about that in our message. We're going to ask, so what does that actually look like? What does it mean to submit? And we're going to spend some time, we're going to have to unpack that a little bit more. We're going to have to reflect on that a little bit more. The husband, and here it gives the pattern, the husband is the head of the wife, Christ is the head of the church. So this idea, maybe we'll use a different color for that. We'll use kind of a maroon. The idea of the head, and we can kind of see that it shows up a couple of times. The husband is the head of the wife as Christ is the head of the church. So already there begins to emerge a pattern there that the marriage relationship is somehow to reflect and to be a portrait or a picture of the relationship between Christ and the church. Here's our word, by the way, we found it again. We're going to just highlight it again. The church submits to Christ. Therefore, wives should submit in everything to their husbands. Maybe we can get our blue marker back again and pick up again. Here's husband. Husband's over here. So you're beginning to notice that the point is, it's not very complicated. Paul is drawing a connection and a relationship between Jesus and the church and the husband and the wife. In some ways, the marriage relationship is to reflect that. And so we're going to have to ask the question, well, what does that actually look like? What does it mean for the marriage relationship to look to reflect that? Let's also, just for the sake of consistency, let's remember to highlight also wives as well, wife or wife, right there, right there, right there. And then, just because we're really going to make it nice and full, we're going to emphasize the church. I'll do a triangle there just so that we can kind of tell them all apart. Oops, I missed an instance of the word wife, but we can come back to that here. You begin to see kind of the pattern. You begin to see over here just what does that actually look like? And this is important. And we'll use, because I'm a stereotypical person, we'll use kind of a pinkish color for the word love. We see it here, love, love. And we're going to go on in a second because there's more to this text here as we're going to see. But that gives you that starts to give you kind of a picture of what this relationship is to look like. Wives to their husbands, husbands to their wives. There's a sense of leadership. There's a sense of authority and submission, but that submission is not an isolation from the submission that all believers are to offer. Okay, let's go on. And again, we're sort of exploring here. We're not coming to any firm conclusions on this. Now we're going to come. Oops. We're going to come to the duty of husbands and towards their wives. Oops. And we're going to highlight here. I forget which color I use. I think I use orange just for the sake of consistency. Husbands, wives is pink. And then the church, what do we say? The church is, I forget, doesn't really matter. Church. Now, what's interesting here is the word, I'll just use a black marker here, the word that, and sometimes you could use the word so that. That's a purpose clause that tells us why does Christ love, and we highlighted the word Christ too. So what do we use for that? Purple. There we go. Here's what's interesting. There's a purpose here, and the purpose is sanctification. So the purpose of Christ loving the church is her sanctification. Oops, I meant to do that in the different color. The purpose of Christ loving the church is her sanctification. It's, God's ultimate intent is to cleanse her and present the church in splendor without wrinkle, spot, or any such thing. So God has a purpose and an intention in loving his church, and that purpose is to see her glorified. There's the word church again. And so then you begin to think, well, what is the purpose in marriage? What is the purpose how does that parallel the relationship between Christ and his church? And again, here's another one of those purpose clauses, and I think they're kind of similar, right? So you see two purposes here: so that he might sanctify her, so that she might be holy and without blemish. So there's this ultimate desire that God has for his church, right? We'll just draw a little church here. And somehow marriage is to reflect that. Now our question is, well, how does that actually work? In what way do we see that? And I'm not sure we're answering that just yet, but we're just kind of drawing some attention to that. Somehow husbands are to show such love and care for their wives. What do we do for love? I don't remember. Maybe I got my colors mixed up. Here's a couple of words: love. But the purpose in loving is such that there's growth and sanctification. So there's, Paul has this vision for marriage in which husbands show love for their wives in a way that sees them grow and develop and become mature, just as Christ loved the church. Now, I don't think it means that it doesn't go both ways, right? Wife loves and honors her husband, and that leads to growth as well. But in Paul's analogy, he's showing the relationship and emphasizing the relationship between Christ and the church. All right, so we get some instructions here in the same way. Well, what same way? Well, we've already answered that. It's as Christ loved the church, right? So husbands love their wives as their own bodies. We've got the word wife over here. See, I probably missed a couple. There's wife there. And yeah, the word church. Yeah, I missed a couple of that as well. So we'll just, for the sake of consistency, make sure we get it all. But you begin to see, and Paul is in a way, and we'll begin to see this a little bit later on. Paul is going back and forth in his analogy. You can't always tell if he's talking about the relationship between Christ and the church and the relationship between husband and wife. But it is clear, I think, that that Paul has a vision and an ideal for marriage that is probably transcends the cultural ideas. You know, if the cultural ideas are about, you know, mutual fulfillment and happiness and let's just, you know, stay together, there's nothing wrong with that. But Paul's vision, it seems, goes bigger than that. He has something far greater in mind, and that is sanctification and reflecting to the world a picture of what the church is all about. So then you begin to ask, well, what does that look like for us? And maybe you begin to ask the question, does my marriage reflect that as well? Is that what I'm seeking in my marriage? You know, so when we talk about submission, obviously that's a controversial topic today. We don't like to talk about it. It seems degrading and so on. But realistically, there's something glorious here. I think we have to acknowledge that, you know, the picture of a husband loving his wife as Christ loved the church is something to be desired. So, listen, this is only the first part. We've just kind of started scratching the surface here. We've explored this text. We've paid attention to some grammar and some of the words and the way that Paul uses it. I'll just draw your attention to one more thing, and that's the conclusion of the text. And I'm not going to say a whole lot about this right now because we'll save it for the message, but I did want to draw your attention to this conclusion where Paul, he talks about, he says, he comes out and says, I'm saying it refers to Christ and the church. And it's kind of like all along you think Paul is talking about husband and wife, and then he comes to this conclusion and he says, no, it's really more Christ in the church. And of course, you know, he comes right back and said, yeah, but each love his wife, let the wife see that she respects her husband. So Paul, it just kind of reinforces that idea that Paul is using these interchangeably. And so we'll have to look at what does that actually look like? How do we actually live that out in our own marriages and in our own relationships? But we're going to save that for the sermon. We're going to come back to some of this and explore some of it in greater detail, and hopefully you'll get a sense, see how this actually applies and challenges us today. Thanks for watching, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel.